The Singing, Chapter 13 of Shardik by Richard Adams, read by Celeste Lawrenson in September 2020. The Singing. All that day Shardik lay beside the brook, shaded, as the sun crossed the meridian, by the bank above and the boughs of the melicon. The two girls who had been watching in the pit during the night had acted prudently enough when the bear first struggled to its feet and wandered up the slope. At first they had thought it was too weak to reach the top, but when it had actually done so, and then, though almost exhausted, had begun to make its way downhill towards the brook, the older girl, Mooney, had followed it, while her comrade went to wake the Tuginda. In fact, Mooney had been only a short distance away when Shardik collapsed beside the pool, but had not seen Keldrek in her haste to return and bring the Tuginda to the place. The girls sent to Kiso were back before midnight, for without the long detour across the river, their upstream journey was much shorter than the first. They brought fresh supplies of the cleansing ointment, together with other medicines and a herbal narcotic. This the Tuginda immediately administered to the bear herself, soaked in the thin segments of the tendriona. For some hours the drug had little effect, but by morning Shardik was sleeping heavily and did not stir while the burns were cleaned once more. On the afternoon of the following day, as Keldrek was returning from the forest where he had been setting snares, he came upon Sheldra standing in the open grass a little way from the camp. Following her gaze, he saw, some distance off, the figure of an unusually tall woman, cloaked and cowled, striding up the slope beside the brook. He recognized her as the lantern-bearer whom he had met by night upon the shore of Kiso. Still further away, by the river, 6 or 7 other women were evidently setting out for the camp, each carrying a load. "Who is that?" asked Keldrek, pointing. "Rantse," replied Sheldra, without turning her eyes towards him. There was still not one of the girls with whom Keldrek felt at ease. Even among themselves they spoke little, using words as they used knives or thread, simply as a means to complete their tasks. There was no contempt for him, however, in their sombre reticence, which in fact he found daunting for precisely the opposite reason, because it suggested respect, and seemed to confer upon him a dignity, even an authority, to which he was unused. They saw him, not as the girls in Ortelga saw a young man, but, as they saw everything else, in the light of the cult to which their lives were devoted. Their manners showed that they felt him to be a person of importance, the one who had first seen and recognized Lord Shardik, and had then come, at the risk of his life, to bring the news to the Tuginda. Sheldra's present reply was not intended contemptuously. She had answered him as briefly as she would have answered any of her companions, and had even, perhaps, forgotten that he, unlike them, did not know the island priestesses by name. He felt it an omission rather than a slight, that she should, in effect, have told him nothing. She had not used as many words as were necessary for informing him, just as she might, though practical and competent, have put too little water in a pail or not enough wood on the fire. Sure of this, at least, he summoned the confidence to speak firmly. "Tell me who Rantse is," he said, "and why she and those other women have been brought here." For a few moments Sheldra did not reply, and he thought, "She's going to ignore me." Then she replied, "Of those who came with the Tuginda, Melithus was the only priestess. The rest of us are novices or servants." "But Melithus must have been almost as young as any," said Keldrek. "Melithus was not an Ortelgan. She was rescued from a slave camp during the Becklin civil wars, the Wars of the Hendril, and brought to the ledges when she was a child. She learned many of the mysteries very early." "Well?" demanded Keldrek, as the girl said no more. "When the Tuginda knew that Lord Shardik had indeed returned, and that we must remain here to tend and cure him, she sent for the priestesses Anthred and Rantse, together with the girls whom they are instructing. When Shardik recovers, they will be needed for the singing." She fell silent again, but then broke out suddenly, "Those who served Lord Shardik long ago had need of all their courage and resolution." "I believe you," answered Keldrek, looking down to where the bear, like a crag beside the pool, lay still and drugged to sleep. Yet, in the same moment, there rose in his heart an abandoned elation, and the conviction that to none but the Tuginda herself had it been given to feel so intensely as he the fierce and mysterious divinity of Shardik. Shardik was more than life to him, a fire in which he was ready, nay, eager to be consumed. And for that very reason Shardik would transform him but not destroy him. This he knew. As though with foreboding, he trembled for an instant in the sultry air, turned, and made his way back to the camp. That night the Tuginda talked with him again, walking slowly back and forth along the bank above the fall, where stood burning that same flat, green rush-shaded lantern that he had followed across the leaping tree-trunk in the dark. Rance, a head taller than himself, kept pace with them on the Tuginda's other side, and as he saw her checking her long stride out of deference to the Tuginda and himself, he remembered with certain wry amusement how he had groped and clambered after her through the steep woods. They spoke of Shardik, and the gaunt, silent priestess listened attentively. "His wounds are clean," said the Tuginda. "The poison has almost left them. The drugs and medicines always work strongly on any creature, whether human or animal, that has never known them before. We can be almost certain now that he will recover. If you had found him only a few hours later, Keldrek, he would have been past our help." Keldrek felt that now at last it was time to ask her the question that had been flickering in his mind for the past 3 days, vanishing and reappearing like a firefly in a dark room. "What are we going to do, Sayet, when he recovers?" "I do not know any more than you. We must wait until we are shown." He blundered on. "But do you mean to take him to Kiso, to the ledges?" "I mean?" For a moment she looked at him coldly, as she had looked at Belcotrazette, but then answered in a brisk, matter-of-fact tone, "You must understand, Keldrek, that it is not for us to make schemes and put them into practice upon Lord Shardik. It is true, as I told you, that sometimes long ago it was the Tuginda's task to bring Shardik home to the ledges, but those were days when we ruled in Bekla, and all was ordered and sure. Now, at this moment, we know nothing, except that Lord Shardik has returned to his people. His message and his purpose we cannot yet discern. Our work is simply to wait, to be ready to perceive and to carry out God's will, whatever it may be." They turned and began to walk back towards the fall. "But that does not mean that we are not to think shrewdly and act prudently," she went on. "By the day after tomorrow the bear will no longer be drugged, and will begin to recover its strength. You are a hunter. What do you think it will do then?" Keldrek felt perplexed. His question had been returned to him without an answer. In spite of what he had heard her say to Belcotrazette, it had never occurred to him that the Tuginda had not in her mind some plan for bringing Shardik to the ledges. What had been puzzling him was how it was to be done, for even if the bear were to remain drugged, the difficulties seemed formidable. Now he realized with a shock that she intended simply to stand by while this enormous wild animal regained its natural strength. If this was indeed, as she evidently believed, the course of humility and faith in God, it was of a kind beyond his experience or understanding. For the first time his trust in her began to waver. She read his thoughts. "We are not buying rope in the market, Keldrek, or selling skins to the factor. Nor are we laboring for the High Baron by digging a pit in the forest, or even choosing a wife. We are offering our lives to God and Lord Shardik, and pledging ourselves humbly to accept whatever he may vouchsafe to give in return. I asked you, what is the bear likely to do?" "It is in a strange place that it does not know Sayet, and will be hungry after its illness. It will look for food, and may well be savage." "Will it wander?" "I have been thinking that soon we shall all be forced to wander. We have little food left, and I cannot hunt alone for so many." "Since we can be sure that the High Baron would refuse to send us food from Ortelga, we must do the best we can. There are fish in the river and duck in the reeds, and we have nets and bows. Choose 6 of the girls and take them out to hunt with you. There may be little enough to share at first, but there will be more as they learn their business." "It can be done for a time, Sayet. Keldrek, are you impatient? Whom have you left in Ortelga?" "No one, Sayet. My parents are dead, and I am not married." "A girl?" He shook his head, but she continued to gaze at him gravely. "There are girls here. Commit no sacrilege now of all times, for the least ill to follow would be our death." He broke out indignantly. "Sayet, how can you think—" She only looked steadily at him, holding his eyes as they paced on and turned about once more under the stars. And before his inward sight rose the figure of Melithus on the terrace. Melithus, dark-haired, white-robed, with the golden collar covering her neck and shoulders. Melithus, laughing as she played with the arrow and the sword, trembling and sweating with fear on the edge of the pit. Where was she now? What had become of her? His protest faltered and ceased. Next day began a life which he was often to recall in after years, a life as clear, as simple and immediate as rain. If he had ever doubted the Chiginda, or wondered what was to come of her humility and faith, he had no time to remember it. At first the girls were so awkward and stupid that he was in despair, and more than once on the point of telling the Chiginda that the task was beyond him. On the first day, while they were driving a Ketlana towards open ground, Zilphi, a mere child and the youngest of his huntresses, whom he had picked for her quickness and energy, mistook his movement in the thicket for that of the quarry, and loosed an arrow that passed between his arm and body. They killed so little all day that he felt compelled to spend the night fishing. In the starlit shallows they netted a great bramba, spine-finned and luminous as an opal. He was about to spear it when the ill-fixed anchor stake carried away, and the fish, plunging heavily, took half the net down with it into the deep water. Nito bit her lip and said nothing. By the second evening the whole camp was hungry, and the thin, ragged bear was kept half-drugged and fed with scraps of fish and ill-spared flour cakes baked in the ashes. But necessity brings out a desperate skill in the clumsiest. Several of the girls were at least passable shots, and on the third day they were lucky enough to kill 5 or 6 geese. They feasted that night by the fire, telling old stories of Bekla long ago, of the hero Deperioth, liberator of Yelda and founder of Sarkid, and of Fleetil, immortal craftsman of the Tamaric Gate, and singing together in strange harmonies unknown to Kildrek, who listened with a kind of tremulous unease, as their voices followed each other round and down, like the fall of the ledges themselves between the woods of Kiso. Soon, indeed, he had forgotten everything but the life of the moment, the wet grass of early morning, when he stood to pray with hands raised towards the distant river. The smell of the trepsis as they searched beneath its leaves for the little gourds that had ripened since the day before, the green light and the heat of the forest, and the tense glances between the girls as they waited in ambush with arrows on the string, the scent of jasmine at evening, and the chunk, chunk, regular as a mill wheel, of the paddles as they made their way upstream to net some likely pool. After the first few days the girls learned quickly, and he was able to send them out by 2s and 3s, some to fish, some to follow a trail in the forest, or hide in the reeds for wildfowl. He was kept busy making arrows, for they lost far too many, until he had taught Mooney to make them better than he could himself. Ortelga he put from his mind, and his fear of Belcotrezette's revenge. At first he dreamed vividly of the Baron, who rose out of the ground of the face of broken stones, and beckoned him to follow into the forest, where the bear was waiting, or walked upon the shore and threw back his cowl to reveal a face of flickering heat, half consumed, red and grey as the glowing furnace of a log flaking in the fire. But soon his dreams changed, turning to vaporous, elusive impressions of stars and flowers reflected in dark water, or of clouds drifting over ruined walls far off upon an empty plain, or he would seem to hear the Tuginda speaking sorrowfully, accusing him, in words that he could never recall, of some ill deed as yet unperformed. It was not that he had ceased either to fear for his life, or to believe that the future held danger. He had simply put these things aside, living, like the other creatures of forest and river, from hour to hour, his senses full of sounds and smells, his mind concerned only with his craft. Often he snatched sleep as a beast snatches it, by day or night, wherever he found himself, and would be roused by a grave, breathless girl with news of a flight of duck offshore, or a band of monkeys approaching through the trees a mile away. All quarry brought in was accepted without question, and often, when Neilith gave him his share out of the iron pot hanging over the fire, he could not imagine what meat it might be, only feeling glad that some of the girls had evidently been successful without his help. It was on the 5th or 6th day after Sheldra had returned from Ortelga with his bow, which she had apparently been able to recover without troubling Belcotrazette, that Keldrek was standing with Zilphi a little inside the forest, half a mile from the camp. They were in hiding beside a barely visible track that led to the shore, waiting for whatever animal might appear. It was evening, and the sunlight had begun to redden the branches above him. Suddenly he heard at a distance the sound of women's voices singing. As he listened, the hair rose on his neck. He remembered the wordless songs by the fire. To his mind, those had suggested, transmuted indeed, yet still familiar, the sound of wind in leaves, of waves on the river, of the pitching of canoes in choppy water, and the falling of rain. What he heard now resembled the movement, over centuries, of things that to men seem motionless only because their own lives are short, the movement of trees as they grow and die, of stars altering their relative places in the heavens, of mountains slowly ground away through millennia of heat, frost, and storm. It was like the building of a city. Great squared blocks of antiphonal sound were being swung and lowered into place, one upon another, until the heart stood far below, gazing up at the clouds marching endlessly across the dark line of the completed ramparts. Zilphi was standing with closed eyes and outstretched palms. Kelderek, though he saw nothing and felt afraid, seemed to himself to have been lifted to some plane on which there was no more need of prayer, since the harmony that is continually present to the mind of God had been made audible to his own prostrate, worshipping soul. He had sunk to his knees, and his mouth was twisted like that of a man in agony. Still listening, he heard the singing diminish, and then slide quickly into silence, like a diver into deep water. He rose and began to walk slowly towards the edge of the forest. Yet it was as though he, awake, observed himself moving in a dream. The dream was his own life of time and sensation, of hunger and thirst, which he now watched from a pinnacle of shining silence. He saw his forearm scratched by a spray of trizata, and felt, far off in his flesh, an echo of pain. Slowly, very slowly, he floated down to rejoin his body. They came together as broken reflections resolve on the surface of a pool returning to stillness, and he found himself looking across the open grass and scratching his arm. Shardik, the sun sinking behind him, was approaching down the slope, now rambling uncertainly here and there, now halting to gaze about at the trees and the distant river. At some distance from him, in a wide half-circle, moved 8 or 9 of the women, among them Ranthe and the Tuginda. When he hesitated, they too paused, swaying in the rhythm of their chant, equidistant from one another, the evening wind stirring their hair and the fringes of their tunics. As he went on, they moved with him, so that he remained always central and ahead of them. None showed haste or fear. Watching, Kelderek was reminded of the instinctive, simultaneous turning of a flock of birds in the air, or a shoal of fish in clear water. It was plain that Shardik was half bemused, though whether from the continuing effect of the drug or the hypnotic sound of the singing the hunter could not tell. The women pivoted about him like wind-tossed branches radiating from the trunk of a tree. Suddenly Kelderek felt a longing to join in their dangerous and beautiful dance, to offer his life to Shardik, to prove himself one among those to whom the power of Shardik had been revealed, and through whom that power could flow into the world. And with this longing came a conviction, though if he were wrong it mattered nothing, that Shardik would not harm him. He stepped out from beneath the trees and made his way up the slope. Until he was less than a stone's throw off, neither the women nor the bear gave any sign of having seen him. Then the bear, which had been moving towards the river rather than the forest, stopped, turning its lowered head towards him. The hunter also stopped and stood waiting, one hand raised in greeting. The setting sun was dazzling him, but of this he was unaware. Through the bear's eyes he saw himself standing alone on the hillside. The bear peered uncertainly across the sunlit grass. Then it came towards the solitary figure of the hunter, approaching until it appeared as a dark mass before his light-blinded eyes, and he could hear its breathing and the dry, clashing sound of its claws. Its rank smell was all about him, yet he was aware only of the smell of himself to Shardik, puzzled and uncertain in his awakening from illness and drugged sleep, afraid because of his own weakness and his unfamiliar surroundings. He sniffed suspiciously at the human creature standing before him, but remained unstartled by any sudden movement or act of fear on its part. He could hear once more the voices, now on one side of him, now on the other, answering each other in layers of sound, bewildering him and confusing his savagery. He went forward again, in the only direction from which they did not come, and as he did so, the human creature, towards whom he felt no enmity, turned and moved with him towards the twilight and safety of the woods. At a signal from the Tuginda, the women stood still, each in her place, as Shardik, with the hunter walking beside him, entered the outskirts of the forest and disappeared among the trees.